Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Have you ever looked around at our hyper-connected, globalized world and wondered, well, how exactly did we get here? How did we go from isolated medieval castles to this? Today, we're embarking on a sweeping, cinematic journey through time. We're going to zero in on the centuries between 1300 and 1700. This is the exact period that saw humanity transition from relatively isolated, feudal societies into a highly complex network of trade, culture, and just unprecedented change. So, if you love seeing how the modern world was stitched together, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's our roadmap for this chapter of history. We'll hit 4 main stops. First, empires and the feudal order. Second, the Renaissance awakening. Third, the Age of Discovery. And finally, number 4, global encounters and impacts. Let's dive right in. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Empires and the Feudal Order, setting the scene.
To really grasp how drastically our cultural traditions changed, we first need to understand the baseline. Think about the world right after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. It was incredibly dangerous and deeply uncertain. Survival literally meant clustering around massive, imposing strongholds. You see this vividly in architecture from the era, like the incredible 14th century Palace of the Popes. Basically, society shrank down into persistent but pretty small, heavily fortified urban centers.
That desperate need for physical protection gave rise to a system you've probably heard of, feudalism. This was an agricultural setup anchored entirely around castles and manors. At the very bottom of this strict hierarchy were the peasants, or serfs. They pledged their back-breaking labor to local lords just to get a tiny strip of land and military protection. And that social ladder stretched all the way up, with local lords pledging loyalty to greater lords, who were in turn vassals to the kings. But here's the thing. Kings weren't the only ones calling the shots. In a brutal world where life expectancy was low and medicine was practically non-existent, the medieval Catholic Church absolutely dominated daily life. It wasn't just a spiritual guide. It actively supported the feudal hierarchy and actually owned vast amounts of land itself. The church built monasteries and, frankly, taught people how to endure this miserable life just to ensure a tolerable one after death. Interestingly, though, they also maintained this incredible network of scholarship stretching all the way from Muslim states in Spain over to Byzantium. Now, no rigid system lasts forever, right? The first real cracks in this feudal order came from commerce. Enter the Mediterranean entrepreneurs. We're talking about maritime cities like Venice and Genoa. Starting around the 12th century, these merchants began building highly lucrative trade networks with Islamic states and the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire. Slowly but surely, serious wealth started pouring back into Europe. Which brings us right to Section 2, the Renaissance awakening, a shift in perspective. For centuries, that feudal mindset had basically viewed life as a grim waiting room for death. But with this new influx of wealth came a massive ideological pivot. Suddenly, there's this intense fascination with humanity and the wonders of life itself. In the 14th century, wealthy individuals in northern Italian towns started looking outward. They were deeply inspired by Islamic literature's respect for living things and Greek art coming in through those Byzantine trade routes. Sculptors, painters, writers, they shifted their entire focus to discovering the living, breathing world right in front of them.
And what's wild is that while Europe is having this intellectual rebirth, the rest of the globe is incredibly dynamic too. Complex developments were happening simultaneously everywhere. Let's look at the timeline. In 1325, the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan is founded in Mexico. In 1368, China's massive Ming dynasty begins. The world was moving so fast, even amidst unimaginable tragedies like the Black Death ravaging Europe and Egypt around 1348. And then, by 1492, European expansion hits the gas pedal as Columbus reaches the West Indies.
This global momentum just accelerates into the 1500s and 1600s. It's truly awe-inspiring when you zoom out. Babur establishes the powerful Mughal Empire in North India. Meanwhile, there's an absolute explosion in scientific thought. I mean, Copernicus literally resetters our entire understanding of the universe in 1543. And by the early 1600s, massive economic and political machines are born, like the British East India Company and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. The world is rapidly and intensely interlocking. So, let's move right along to Section 3, the Age of Discovery, expanding the map. This newfound Renaissance curiosity, mixed with a very serious hunger for wealth, pushed European geographic limits further than ever before. But curiosity isn't enough. You need the technology. By the end of the 15th century, the key to breaking these boundaries was the heavy, formidable European ship.
These incredibly complex, heavily rigged vessels finally allowed Spanish and Portuguese navigators to survive pushing way down the treacherous western coast of Africa, which eventually led to journeys entirely around the Cape of Good Hope.
But seriously, what actually compels a sailor to board a creaky wooden ship and sail off the edge of the known map? Well, strategy and, frankly, greed. First, everyone wanted direct access to high-demand Indian spices, cutting out the middlemen to maximize profit. Second, explorers like Columbus were fiercely motivated and funded to establish a direct western route to India. And third, you had crews braving the freezing elements to try and discover northern routes to Asia via the Arctic.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 4, Global Encounters and Impacts, Collision of Worlds.
So, the map has been expanded, the ships have sailed, now we have to examine the explosive consequences when these vastly different global cultures finally collide. It's so vital to remember that Europeans weren't just sailing into an empty void. They were stumbling into deeply established, rich societies with their own robust economies. From the astonishing bronze metalworking in African kingdoms to the monumental, intricate architecture of Asian dynasties, these were complex civilizations that had already been thriving for centuries.
It's easy to look at history from 30,000 feet, but these early cross-cultural interactions were deeply personal and immensely complicated. Take Hassan al-Wazan, a North African geographer who ended up writing the very first geography of Africa for Pope Leo X. Or Will Adams, an English pilot who washed ashore in Japan and somehow became a trusted counselor to the shogun himself. And over in the Americas, you have Dona Marina, an Aztec woman who became a crucial translator and negotiator for the Spanish conqueror Cortés.
Now, European behavior during these encounters was, well, it was a massive, sweeping contradiction. On the one hand, some explorers, and even the Catholic Church itself, could be cautious, observant, and genuinely eager to learn foreign languages and study new cultures. On the other hand, their approach was frequently overbearing, violently aggressive and cruel, eagerly enforcing trade monopolies by sheer military force. Paradoxically, the exact same institutions studying these diverse cultures also encouraged ruthless attacks on people they deemed unchristian.
But flipping the perspective is equally telling, because non-Europeans certainly didn't immediately view these new arrivals as invincible world conquerors. In Islamic lands, India, and China, Europeans were treated as mere curiosities, just these hardy, uncultured traders who had little to contribute to their far wealthier societies. In Japan, leaders recognized a tactical advantage and quickly co-opted European musket technology, mass-producing it themselves. And in the Americas, indigenous enemies of the Aztec Empire strategically used these newcomers as pawns to challenge the dominant regional power.
However, the most profound impact of these encounters wasn't military strategy or even new trade goods. It was biological. I need you to pause for a second and just absorb this statistic. 90%. That is the percentage of indigenous people in some American areas completely wiped out by the end of the 16th century. The primary cause? Devastating diseases that Europeans brought with them across the ocean, against which local populations had absolutely zero natural immunity.
The global map was finally connected, but it came at a staggering human cost. The relentless race by European kingdoms to control newly discovered land, extract precious resources, and dominate global trade routes resulted in constant, brutal warfare. This unyielding drive led directly to the massive displacement, enslavement, and extermination of native peoples. The lives of men and women across multiple continents were violently transformed beyond recognition.
Which leaves us with a final, really provocative question to take away from our explainer today. Was the sharing of ideas, inventions, and goods across continents worth the massive displacement and extermination of millions? It really is the ultimate paradox of the period between 1300 and 1700. The foundations of our modern, incredibly interconnected world were laid during this era, but they were built upon a profoundly heavy human toll. I'll leave you to deeply ponder that historical cost. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, keep learning.